Think about the most recent news headlines you might have read. Was it completely objective, void of any suggestions or languages that might lead readers down one particular path of understanding or another? Or did it, more likely, contain subtle cues about how the message was being framed, casting doubt on its veracity or reliability? Every day, we are inundated with these types of texts that on the surface proclaim to be arbiters of truth, but due to simple word choice and message framing, can bias their consumers. Luckily, new tools are being developed to help us become more critical recipients of media. Today, we'll chat with Diyi Yang about how artificial intelligence, AI, can help us identify this subjective bias in text and how AI itself can reflect our own preexisting biases. I'm Ayana Howard, Chair of Georgia Tech School of Interactive Computing, and this is the Interaction Hour. Diyi Yang is an assistant professor in Georgia Tech School of Interactive Computing. She received her PhD in computer science from the Language Technologies Institute at Carnegie Mellon in 2019. She's received a number of awards, including the Facebook PhD Fellowship in 2017 and 2019. She's also author on a paper titled Automatically Neutralizing Subjective Bias in Text at the upcoming AAAI Conference on Artificial Intelligence. Diyi, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
So I'm excited about this conversation we're about to have. So I want to begin with this paper at AAAI, which will take place February 7th through 12th in New York City. The paper, from my understanding, addresses a particularly vital yet challenging area of AI, which is subjective bias in text. Tell us a little about this.
Yep. So texts such as news articles, encyclopedia, and even some social media strive to avoid the biased language. Well, despite this, bias is still everywhere. And a recent survey showed that over 62% of Americans believe that their news is biased. And the single largest source for bias actually accounts for the distrust in the media. And our goal in our work is try to build AI algorithms to automatically reduce bias in text. So specifically, we look at one type of bias, which we call subjective bias. So subjective bias occurs when language that should be neutral and fair is dominated by feeling, opinion, consciously or even unconsciously. So in this work, we introduce a very large-scale corpus of biased language for researchers who want to study biased language. We also introduced two strong deep learning models for this task. We also tested our models on several data from our real-world scenarios, such as on Wikipedia, on political speech, on news headlines, and also on political books. We found that our algorithm can actually identify and reduce those bias. So I would say that this work is a very important first step towards automatically managing bias in this real world.
So this is great. So I can think about all the news that's out there and these headlines. It means with your tool, I can apply it and it can tell me whether maybe I'm being persuaded one way or another.
Yep. So in this paper, we actually introduced this algorithm. So our algorithm can help you identify which portion of your text, such as news articles, headline, which portion might be biased. And then what we will do is that the algorithm will try to remove them and also suggest alternative wording choices that could make the sentence have the same semantic content meaning with the original one, but are more neutral and less biased.
Okay, so why this? I mean, this fascinates me, but why bias? I mean, what motivated you to look into this, and what are some examples of this bias that you're talking about?
Yep. So this actually goes back to another project that we published last summer. So in that work, we look at how people use language to persuade others to take actions. So we mainly look at what makes loan requests effective or persuasive in a peer-to-peer lending platform. So in that context, people write a request to raise funds for their project. But we found that most projects still suffer from very low success rates. So our goal is that can we develop algorithms to help people write a more persuasive and successful pitch? So it turns out that we can. And in that work, our models can quantify how persuasive each request is and what type of persuasion strategies you use. So some of the widely used strategy include the scarcity, such as last day on sale, you should buy this as soon as possible. But we also realized that there are a lot of unwanted framing in those messages. So how could we handle those unwanted framing or subjective framing to give readers some neutral and less subjective version of the same message? So that was what triggered this current project. So here, when we see bias, we actually refer to these subjective bias. That is, something should be neutral and fair, but people use subjective language with presupposition that lead to some prejudice there. So some examples we have, for example, if people say a programmer always starts his career in tech company, in that case, we kind of presuppose that a programmer should be male, which is kind of not the case. So what we are doing in our work is that we are trying to rephrase that message into something like programmers always start their career in big tech company. So that's one example we have.
So that's a great example, because that's an example of, I would say, gender bias in language. And so if we go a little further, let's define the problem a little broader, because you gave an example of gender bias and then persuasion with respect to loan requests as the motivating factor, which of course I love. I may have to ask you offline how to do that. I always needed some extra funding for my own research. And so if we look at this definition of bias, what I want is, can you quantify and define this definition and really link it to why language is so important as we think about bias?
Yep. So first, framing bias in some kind of the formal definition we have refers to people using subjectivity language with some presupposition, talking about opinions as facts or using some of the judgmental language. So one example is this his or her kind of gender bias. Another example you may often encounter in news headlines could be like John McCain exposed as an unprincipled politician. In that sentence, it is biased because the verb expose kind of assume that's a truth. And a non-biased version could be that using a verb such as describe. So you will transform that sentence into something like John McCain described as an unprincipled politician. So this type of framing bias is very subtle. And even like for human, we may not be able to recognize them or know the difference at first glance.
So basically there is power in your words.
Yes. So language kind of, we communicate about our opinions, our thoughts in language, and language may influence how we perceive others and may contain prejudice or stereotypes.
So I like this concept. And the example you gave about expose by versus describe, I didn't even get it. Like you said, expose. I'm like, yeah, that's like obviously true. And yeah, I can see how this really will impact the way you look or view certain issues. Fascinating. So let's talk about this area of research and what we talked about, biasing, using framing for this. Now, your research suggests that we can actually develop a system that recognizes and treats this as a problem. Can you describe a little bit, and more in a high level, of how you would integrate this and use it?
Yep. So actually, we leverage the recent advances in deep learning. So basically, we use a sequence-to-sequence neural network model to recognize potentially biased words in sentence first. And then our model will look at each word in a sentence to predict whether that word might be biased or not, given the context. And then once we identify them, our model will try to remove such biased text and then decode a new sentence with alternative words. So this new sentence will have similar semantic content meaning as the original one, but less subjective, more neutral, and fair. So recently at Georgia Tech, we are also building an intervention system where users can input any message, and our systems will highlight which potential words might be biased or toxic or hateful, and then we can suggest alternative wording to help users make their message better. And this is somewhere our technology can help and can lead to real-world benefits.
So when you had mentioned that one of the basic algorithms is the start or the input is deep learning. And we had another podcast where we talked about defining deep learning. And one of the things I remember was that there is a lot of data that you need. And so for this one, how do you collect your data to figure out how to mitigate the bias?
So we take advantage of Wikipedia. So on Wikipedia, we assume that all the articles there kind of convey neutral point of view. So that's kind of our definition of the subjective bias. So basically, editors will make a change to articles, and then one editor may insert a sentence that could be biased, and another senior editor will come here and make further edits, and also tell us that, hey, I make this edit because it's biased. So this is where we get our ground truth label. And one contribution of this research is that we introduced this very large scale with 180,000 sentence pairs. So this kind of make the deep learning possible in this case.
So 180,000, that seems like a lot of data. So is this something that we might see one day, say on Facebook or Twitter, as a tool to help us as consumers maybe identify things like biased news posts?
Yeah, definitely. This have a lot of implications for example, like identifying what type of articles might contain bias. And in addition to that, we are offering suggestions. So as I mentioned, right now we are building an intervention. So in this system, you can input any text there, and then the system will tell you how biased this sentence could be. And then if so, it will highlight the portion that contain the biased words or phrase. And also, when you move your mouse there, it will give you suggestions of some other words that you could use that could make the same meaning there, but less biased.
So I like this. I mean, because it fits right into social good and what we should be using AI for. But I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate. So I think about this, and we're suggesting these alternative words that could possibly alter the intended message, because my intended message is to persuade you. So I guess the question is this actually good all the time?
Well, this is a harder question. So first, different messages, they serve different purpose in different contexts, right? So if you, as a reader, you want to have a factual summary of a topic, or if you are reading Wikipedia, maybe a neutral article is a right thing for you. But if you want to see articles that have different perspectives or learn different aspects about the same event, then maybe this kind of neutralized message may not be so necessary. So in our case, we are not trying to remove every opinion or framing from the language. Instead, we are trying to see whether we can provide more context and more kind of neutral description to consumers of those messages.
Okay, so it's basically a tool to really increase understanding for all users, all consumers. Awesome. So, okay, we have this technology. It's on my social media. I can find the words that make it so that I remove any biases, including gender bias. So I guess my question is how do you convince people to actually pay attention to this and use these tools in the future?
Yeah, so this is a challenge we face with all sorts of technologies we develop those days. And I would say technology is just technology. And as researchers, we need to keep the human in the loop or at the center of our development. And like in this case, although we could offer or suggest some neutral descriptions for some subjective bias attacks, users will have 100% control of what they want to view and whether they want to look at the neutral version or the original version. So this is their choice.
So we talk about language, and one of the examples you gave early on was this aspect of gender bias. And so, I mean, technology in general and yours, we're talking about it allows us to observe and mitigate bias. And so let's go the other way. We know that there are some algorithms themselves that are biased. In the case you gave, it's people using biased language. So, I mean, maybe we have the image recognition software that generates a caption for a female in a kitchen and says woman cooking in a kitchen. And for a man, it says, man fixing a faucet. Like we know that this is a classical example. So I guess my question is do you think this is a problem in terms of our AI algorithms themselves?
Yeah, this is definitely a big problem. So as researchers, our goal is that we hope our technology can make our world a better place. And language is a key component here because we communicate our opinions and feelings through language. We convey our products also through language. It can influence the way how we perceive others, and also sometimes it carry good intentions, and some other time like stereotypes, and it may enhance our prejudice towards others. To give another example, let's say you are writing a recommendation letter or evaluation for your students or employee. You will see how important those subjective language could be and could reflect our unconscious bias. So recently research showed that letters we wrote for female students always use words such as well-organized, polite, and then focus more on the teaching side of their achievement. While for men, we describe them as action-oriented and skills publications. This subtle difference between plan versus action, between teaching versus their research and career can unconsciously influence how we perceive people, right? So imagine that we could have an AI system or toolkit that could recognize this in our writing or in our daily communication and then provide guidance to the writer about how to avoid such biased language. That would be great, and that's what we are doing.
I also agree that would be great. A toolkit to actually mitigate bias. And so if I kind of think about this, language is our way of communicating, but of course language can also bias the conversation. And so if you think about your toolkit and what you're really thinking about and doing is to use AI to really enhance the quality of our communication by providing alternatives to our language, which I think is a great idea. So kind of summarizing, does this allow consumers then to also take action to remove bias?
Yes. So we are in the stage of building this toolkit right now based on what we have on this Wikipedia data. And we are trying to train the model also on other kind of domain because kind of generalization is a big issue in the deep learning field. So right now it can recognize bias for very formal text. The next stage is that we are going to experiment with informal like daily use type of language so that it could finally become a toolkit that everybody could use to help their writing. And this is an issue even for, especially for like English as a second language learners. So it will lead to real world benefits.
So I want to thank you. We have a call to action to everyone to remove bias. And with your intellect and your research and your toolkit, we may have a chance of actually doing this.
Yes, I hope so.
So I just enjoyed this conversation with Diyi about looking at language and the ways that she thinks about mitigating bias through the language and with her tools. Remember, she will be presenting her paper and talking more about her paper at the AAAI conference coming up in New York. And be sure to check out all our coverage of the AAAI conference at Georgia Tech online now at ic.gatech.edu. If you like what you heard and are interested in learning more or suggesting your own topics for the podcast, be sure to connect with us on Twitter or Facebook at IC@GT. Thanks for listening.